They told Sergeant Thomas Hayes to forget what he saw in that train, to burn the documents and bury the truth deep in the Louisiana mud. But when he looked at the faces of his men, when he held those papers proving that American officers were selling weapons to the enemy, he made a choice that would cost him everything. He didn't burn the evidence, he kept it. And what happened next proved that some betrayals cut deeper than any enemy bullet ever could. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you're listening in the comments. April 1945. The war in Europe was dying in its final gasps, but in the backwoods of Louisiana, Sergeant Thomas Hayes stood in ankle-deep mud, staring at a problem that had nothing to do with Germany or Japan. Rain hammered down through the pine canopy, turning the dirt road into a river of brown sludge that sucked at boots and swallowed truck tires whole. Somewhere ahead, past the wall of cypress trees draped in Spanish moss, a freight train sat derailed and silent. Hayes wiped rain from his face and studied the map again, though he'd memorized every line an hour ago. The train had been carrying supplies from the port in New Orleans to Fort Polk, routine transport. Nothing special, except it never arrived. And now command wanted Hayes and his squad to find it, assess the damage, and report back. Simple enough. But nothing about this felt simple. Behind him, 8 men sat in the back of a deuce and a half, their uniforms soaked black, water dripping from helmet brims. The 761st Transportation Company, an all-black supply unit tasked with the unglamorous work of moving crates, fixing roads, and cleaning up messes nobody else wanted to touch. They weren't infantry. They weren't heroes in the newspapers. They were the invisible machinery that kept the war running, and Hayes had been their sergeant for 2 years. Private Leonard Washington leaned out from under the canvas tarp, his voice cutting through the rain. "Sarge, we getting closer or we driving in circles?" Hayes folded the map and stuffed it inside his jacket. Close. Another mile, maybe less. The radio said the tracks run straight through that stretch of swamp. Can't miss it. Corporal Eddie Grant, a wiry man from Alabama with a face like chiseled stone, spat into the mud. Can't miss it. That's what they said about the last 3 supply drops, and we spent 2 days pulling trucks out of ditches. Hayes didn't argue. Grant had a point. Louisiana in the spring was a maze of waterlogged roads, shifting trails, and terrain that changed every time it rained. The war might be ending overseas, but here, nature was still putting up a fight. The truck lurched forward again, engine groaning as the driver, Private Leon Barnes, fought the wheel. The tires spun, caught traction, then spun again. Hayes gripped the side rail and shouted over the noise, "Easy, Barnes, we're not storming a beach." Barnes, a kid from Chicago who couldn't have been more than 20, grinned despite the mud splattered across his face. "Feels like it, Sarge." They pushed deeper into the swamp. The trees grew thicker, their roots twisting up through the water like skeletal fingers. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle should have echoed. But there was only silence, broken by the hiss of rain and the low rumble of the truck's engine. Then Washington shouted, "There, off to the left." Hayes turned and saw it. Through the curtain of rain, barely visible between the trees, the dark outline of a train. Boxcars tilted at unnatural angles, some half submerged in the swamp water, others leaning against trees that had buckled under the weight. The locomotive sat nose down in the mud, its smokestack pointing toward the grey sky like a broken monument. Barnes killed the engine. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Hayes climbed out of the truck, boots splashing into water that came up past his ankles. The rest of the squad followed, moving cautiously, rifles slung but hands ready. It was instinct. Even here, thousands of miles from any front line, you didn't approach something unknown without being prepared. Grant moved up beside Hayes, his voice low. "Train's been here a while. Look at the rust on those wheels." Hayes nodded. The derailment wasn't fresh. Days, maybe a week. Moss had already started creeping up the sides of the boxcars, and the metal showed signs of exposure. Why the hell did it take command this long to send us? Grant shrugged. Maybe they didn't care. Supply train goes missing, they write it off and order another one. Maybe. But Hayes didn't believe that. The army didn't forget about entire trains, especially not ones carrying military cargo. Something else was going on. The squad spread out, moving along the length of the derailed train. 12 boxcars in total, each one sealed with heavy padlocks and military stencils marking them as U.S. Army property. Hayes approached the nearest car and tested the lock. Rusted but solid. He pulled a bolt cutter from his pack and snapped it open with a metallic crack that echoed through the swamp. The door slid open with a groan, and the smell hit him first. Damp wood, mildew, and something else, something metallic. Hayes stepped inside, pulling a flashlight from his belt. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of wooden crates stacked floor to ceiling. Standard military containers, nothing unusual. He moved closer, prying open the lid of the nearest crate with his knife. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were rifles. Brand new M1 Garands, still coated in factory grease. Hayes frowned. Rifles weren't unusual cargo, but these weren't being shipped to a base. They were sitting in a derailed train in the middle of nowhere, sealed and forgotten. Washington appeared in the doorway. "What we got, Sarge?" "Weapons." Hayes moved to the next crate and opened it. More rifles. He opened a third. Ammunition. Thousands of rounds, neatly packed and labeled. Everything you'd need to arm a battalion. Washington whistled low. "That's a lot of firepower to just leave sitting in a swamp." Hayes didn't answer. He was already moving to the next boxcar. Grant had it open, and inside were more crates. But these weren't weapons. Hayes cracked one open and froze. Staring back at him, gleaming even in the dim light, were gold bars. Rows of them, stamped with U.S. Treasury marks. Grant's voice was barely a whisper. Jesus Christ. Hayes reached out and touched one. Heavy, cold, unmistakable. He moved to another crate. More gold. And another. The entire boxcar was filled with it. Millions of dollars worth sitting in a train that was supposed to be carrying routine supplies. Behind him, the rest of the squad had gathered. No one spoke. They just stared at the impossible wealth stacked in front of them, rain dripping from their helmets onto the floor. Finally, Washington broke the silence. "Sarge, what the hell is this?" Hayes didn't have an answer, but he knew one thing. This wasn't a supply train. This was something else entirely, and whoever had been moving it didn't want it found. He turned to Grant. "Check the other cars, all of them. I want to know what else is on this train." As the squad moved through the remaining boxcars, Hayes returned to the locomotive. The engineer's cabin was empty, no bodies, no signs of struggle, just an abandoned control panel and a logbook sitting on the seat. He picked it up and flipped through the pages. Standard entries. Departure times, cargo manifests, route information. Nothing unusual until the last page. There, in handwriting that didn't match the rest of the log, was a single line. Delivery rerouted. Await further instruction. No signature. No date. Hayes stared at the words, his mind racing. Rerouted. By who? And why? Grant's voice cut through the rain. "Sarge, you need to see this." Hayes climbed down and followed Grant to the rear of the train. The last boxcar sat half submerged, its door hanging open. Inside, floating in murky water, were wooden crates marked with stencils he recognized. German military insignia, Italian markings, equipment from the Axis powers mixed in with American cargo. And there, tucked into a waterproof case bolted to the wall, were documents. Hayes pulled them free and opened the case. Inside were shipping manifests, coded communications, and a list of names. American names, officers' names, men who were supposed to be fighting the war, not profiting from it. Hayes read through the papers, his jaw tightening with every line. Weapons sold, gold transferred, routes arranged. This wasn't a derailment. This was a black market operation, and it went all the way to the top. Washington appeared beside him, his face pale. "Sarge, what do we do with this?" Hayes looked at his men, 8 soldiers who'd spent the war moving supplies, following orders, doing the work nobody else wanted. They weren't supposed to find this. They weren't supposed to know. And now that they did, everything had changed. He folded the documents carefully and placed them back in the case. "We report it, all of it." Grant shook his head. "You report this, Sarge, and we're done. You know that, right? They'll bury us before they let this get out." Hayes met his eyes. "Then we make sure it doesn't get buried." But even as he said it, standing in the rain with a derailed train full of secrets behind him, Thomas Hayes knew that some truths were too dangerous to survive. And the moment he decided to fight for this one, he'd already lost. The radio crackled to life at 1600 hours, and Hayes knew before the voice even spoke that everything was about to change. He'd sent the report 3 hours ago. 3 hours of waiting in the rain, watching his men guard a train full of secrets that could destroy careers, end lives, and rewrite the story of who was really winning this war. Now command was calling back, and the tone in the operator's voice told him everything he needed to know. This wasn't going to be a congratulations. Hayes pressed the receiver to his ear, rain drumming on the canvas roof of the radio tent they'd set up beside the derailed train. The signal was weak, broken by static and distance, but the words came through clear enough. "Sergeant Hayes, this is Captain Milhouse, Fort Polk Operations. Confirm your position and status." Hayes glanced at Grant, who stood just outside the tent, rifle across his chest, water streaming off his helmet. "Confirmed, sir. We're at the derailment site, approximately 8 miles southeast of Highway 171. Train is a total loss. Cargo is intact." There was a pause, long enough that Hayes wondered if the connection had dropped. Then Milhouse's voice returned, sharper now. "What exactly did you find in that cargo, Sergeant?" Hayes chose his words carefully. "Standard military supplies, sir. Weapons, ammunition. Also found approximately 12 crates of gold bars marked U.S. Treasury. And documents, manifests, communications. Some of it doesn't match the official cargo list." Another pause, longer this time. Hayes could hear voices in the background, muffled and urgent. When Milhouse spoke again, his tone had shifted. It wasn't the voice of an officer addressing a subordinate. It was something else, something colder. "Sergeant, I need you to clarify something. When you say documents, what specifically are you referring to?" Hayes felt the weight of the question. He knew what Milhouse wanted. He wanted Hayes to say he hadn't read them, that he'd sealed them back up and left them alone, that he didn't know what they contained. But Hayes had read them, every page, and now he had to decide how much of the truth to tell. "Shipping records, sir. Coded communications, lists of transactions. Some of the materials in this train aren't U.S. Army issue. There's enemy equipment mixed in with our cargo, and the gold, it's not listed on any manifest I can find." Silence. Then a new voice cut through the static, older, authoritative. "This is Colonel Hargrove. Sergeant Hayes, listen to me very carefully. You are to secure that site immediately. No one enters those boxcars without direct authorization. No one photographs anything. No one removes anything. Is that understood?" "Yes, sir." Hayes kept his voice steady. "But, sir, with respect, this cargo, it needs to be investigated. There are irregularities that suggest—" The colonel cut him off. "I don't need your assessment, Sergeant. I need you to follow orders. You and your men will remain on site until a recovery team arrives. That team will handle the cargo. Your job is to guard it until then, nothing more." Hayes felt his jaw tighten. "When will the recovery team arrive, sir?" 24 hours, maybe less. In the meantime, you're under strict orders. Radio silence except for emergencies. No written reports, no photographs. You guard that train and you keep your mouth shut. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir. But the documents—" "Forget the documents, Sergeant." Hargrove's voice was ice. "Whatever you think you saw, you didn't. That train was carrying routine supplies that were damaged in the derailment. That's the official story. That's the only story. Do you understand me?" Hayes looked out through the tent flap at his men. Washington was crouched beside one of the boxcars cleaning his rifle. Barnes sat on an empty crate, smoking a cigarette that was more water than tobacco. Grant stood watching Hayes, his expression unreadable. These men had seen what Hayes had seen. They'd opened the crates. They'd read the manifests. They knew the truth. "I understand, sir." Hayes said the words, but they tasted like ash. "Good." Hargrove's tone softened slightly. "Sergeant, I know this isn't what you signed up for, but sometimes in war we encounter situations that are above our pay grade. This is one of those situations. You do your job, you follow orders, and you go home when this is over. That's how this works. Are we clear?" "Crystal, sir." The line went dead. Hayes set down the receiver and stood there in the silence, listening to the rain. Outside, Grant approached, his boots sucking at the mud. Hayes stepped out of the tent to meet him. What did they say? Grant's voice was low, meant only for Hayes. They want us to forget what we saw. Guard the train until a recovery team shows up, then we're done. Grant nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Hayes's face. And you believe that? Hayes didn't answer right away. He looked at the train, half swallowed by the swamp, its secrets sealed behind rusted metal and military locks. He thought about the gold, the weapons, the documents with names he recognized. Officers. Men who were supposed to be fighting the same war Hayes was fighting. Men who'd found a way to profit from it instead. No. Hayes met Grant's eyes. I don't believe it. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then what are we going to do? Before Hayes could answer, Washington jogged over, his rifle slung across his back. Sarge, we got a problem. That last boxcar, the one that's half underwater, the door's been forced open. Wasn't like that an hour ago. Hayes felt ice in his gut. Show me. They moved quickly through the rain, boots splashing through puddles that had become small lakes. The rear boxcar sat at the end of the train, tilted at a 45-degree angle, its lower half submerged in dark water. The door, which Hayes had personally secured with a chain and lock, hung open. The chain lay in the mud, cut clean through. Grant knelt and picked up the severed chain. Bolt cutters. Recent. Metals still bright where it was cut. Hayes scanned the tree line. The swamp pressed in on all sides, thick and impenetrable. Anyone could be out there. Anyone could have been watching. He turned to Washington. When's the last time you walked the perimeter? 30 minutes ago. Didn't see nothing. Grant stood, his hand moving to the rifle on his back. They're watching us. Hayes nodded. Whoever had cut that chain had done it quietly, quickly, and without being seen. That took skill. That took planning. And it meant they weren't dealing with scavengers or locals. This was something else. Washington's voice was tight. Sarge, what the hell did we walk into? Hayes looked at the open boxcar, then at his men. Something bigger than us. He raised his voice, addressing the entire squad. Everyone. On me. Now. The men gathered quickly, forming a loose circle in the rain. 8 faces, young and old, all of them watching Hayes with the same question in their eyes. Hayes had commanded these men for 2 years. He'd kept them alive through supply runs, equipment failures, and the general chaos of a military that didn't always remember they existed. Now he had to make a decision that could cost them everything. Listen up. Hayes kept his voice calm, authoritative. Command wants us to guard this train until a recovery team arrives. They want us to forget what we found. They want us to keep quiet. He paused. But before we do that, I need to know if any of you have a problem with that. No one spoke. Rain pattered against helmets, against the canvas of the nearby tent, against the metal skin of the derailed train. Finally, Grant broke the silence. What are you really asking, Sarge? Hayes looked him in the eye. I'm asking if you believe what we found in that train needs to see the light of day, or if you think we should follow orders and let it disappear. Barnes spoke up, his voice uncertain. Sarge, we're supply soldiers. We move crates. We fix trucks. This, whatever this is, it's not our fight. Washington shook his head. It is if we're the only ones who know about it. Grant stepped forward. They'll bury us if we talk. You know that, right? They'll transfer us, discharge us, maybe worse. We're 8 black soldiers who stumbled onto something we weren't supposed to find. You think they're going to let us just walk away with that? Hayes nodded. You're right. That's exactly what will happen. He let that sink in. But if we don't talk, if we let this go, then everything in that train, the gold, the weapons, the proof that our own officers are selling us out, it all disappears. And we go back to moving crates like nothing happened. Then what do we do? Washington's question hung in the air. Hayes pulled the waterproof case from inside his jacket, the documents he'd taken from the last boxcar, the evidence. We make copies, we hide them, and when the time is right, we make sure the right people see them. Grant's expression darkened. And who are the right people, Sarge? Everyone above us is either in on this or too scared to do anything about it. Then we go higher. Hayes said it with more confidence than he felt. We find someone who cares more about the truth than about protecting careers. The men exchanged looks. No one spoke, but Hayes could see the calculation in their eyes, the risk, the fear, the weight of what he was asking them to do. Finally, Washington nodded. "I'm in." One by one, the others followed. Grant was last, his jaw set. "This is insane, Sarge, you know that." Hayes almost smiled. "Yeah, I know." But even as he said it, standing in the rain with his men around him and a train full of secrets behind him, Thomas Hayes felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. He'd just crossed a line, and there was no going back. Night fell over the swamp like a curtain, and with it came sounds that didn't belong. Hayes heard them from his position beside the radio tent, where he'd been transcribing documents by flashlight for the past 3 hours. His hand cramped from writing, his eyes burned from squinting at faded ink, but he kept going. Every name, every transaction, every route. He was copying it all onto paper he'd torn from supply logs, folding each page carefully and sealing it in a waterproof pouch. The sound came again. A splash. Too deliberate to be an animal, too careful to be natural. Hayes clicked off his flashlight and listened. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving behind a wet silence broken only by the drip of water from leaves and the distant call of night birds. But this was different. This was human. Grant appeared beside him without a sound, moving like smoke. His voice was barely a whisper. East side, maybe 2 of them, been watching for the past 10 minutes. Hayes slipped the documents inside his jacket and picked up his rifle. The squad had set up a perimeter around the train, 2 men on watch at all times, rotating every 4 hours. It was standard procedure. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the darkness pressed closer, and every shadow seemed to hide something. They moved together through the mud, keeping low, using the derailed boxcars as cover. Hayes's heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. 2 years of moving supplies hadn't made him a combat soldier, but the army had taught him how to move, how to watch, how to survive. And right now, survival meant knowing who was out there in the dark. Washington was crouched behind the tilted locomotive, his rifle pointed toward the tree line. When he saw Hayes and Grant approaching, he gestured with 2 fingers toward a gap in the cypress trees about 50 yards out. Hayes followed the direction and saw it. Movement. Brief, barely visible, but there. Someone was watching them. Hayes settled in beside Washington, his voice low. "How many?" 2, maybe 3. "They're good. Only reason I spotted them is because one of them stepped on a branch." Grant scanned the darkness with narrowed eyes. "Military? Has to be. Nobody else would be out here." Hayes considered their options. They could challenge whoever was out there, call them out, demand identification. But if these were the people behind the train, the ones who'd been running this operation, then confrontation could get ugly fast. On the other hand, sitting here doing nothing meant giving them time to prepare, to plan, to decide how to handle 8 soldiers who knew too much. Before Hayes could make a decision, a voice called out from the darkness, clear, authoritative, American. "Sergeant Hayes, we need to talk." Hayes felt his stomach tighten. They knew his name. Grant's hand moved to his rifle, but Hayes put a hand on his shoulder. "Wait." He raised his voice, projecting across the distance. "Identify yourself." A figure stepped out of the tree line, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a uniform that even in the darkness Hayes recognized as officer issue. The man kept his hands visible away from his sidearm. Behind him, 2 more figures remained in the shadows, rifles lowered but ready. Major William Brennan, Army Intelligence. The officer stopped about 20 yards from the train. "I'm here to talk, Sergeant, not to fight." Hayes stood slowly, keeping his rifle across his chest. "You're a long way from Fort Polk, Major." Brennan's expression was unreadable in the dim light. "So are you. Mind if I come closer?" This conversation would go better if we weren't shouting. Hayes glanced at Grant, who shook his head slightly. But Hayes knew they didn't have much choice. If Brennan wanted a fight, he could have brought more men. The fact that he was here, talking, meant something else was happening. Hayes nodded. "Come ahead, but your men stay where they are." Brennan approached alone, his boots sucking at the mud with each step. When he was close enough, Hayes could see his face, mid-40s, weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much and forgotten how to look surprised. This wasn't a man who'd spent the war behind a desk. This was someone who knew how to operate in the dark. The Major stopped a few feet from Hayes and looked at the derailed train. "Hell of a mess, isn't it?" Hayes didn't answer. Brennan smiled faintly. "You're wondering why I'm here. Fair question. The truth is, Sergeant, you found something that a lot of people would prefer stayed lost. And now we have a situation. We reported it." Hayes kept his voice even. "Command knows what's in that train." Brennan nodded. "They do, and they sent me to clean it up." He met Hayes's eyes. "That includes you and your men." Grant stepped forward, his rifle shifting slightly. "That a threat, Major?" Brennan held up a hand. "Easy. I'm not here to threaten anyone. I'm here to offer you a way out." He looked at Hayes. "You're smart, Sergeant. Smart enough to know that what you found in those boxcars doesn't just implicate a few rogue officers. This goes higher, a lot higher. And the people involved, they have resources, they have influence. And they have a very strong interest in making sure this never sees daylight. Then why are you here talking?" Hayes's question was sharp. "Why not just take care of us and be done with it?" "Because I'm not them." Brennan's voice was quiet but firm. "I'm the guy they sent to contain this, but I'm also the guy who's been watching this operation for 6 months, trying to build a case. You just handed me the evidence I needed. Those documents you've been copying, they're the key to everything." Hayes felt ice in his veins. "How did you know about the copies?" Brennan smiled grimly. "Because I would have done the same thing." He paused. "Look, Sergeant, I know you don't trust me. You have no reason to. But I'm going to lay this out for you plain. Tomorrow morning, a recovery team is going to arrive. They're not here to secure evidence. They're here to destroy it. Every crate, every bar of gold, every piece of paper in that train is going to disappear. And if you and your men are still here when that happens, you're going to disappear too." Washington's voice cut through the darkness. "Then what do you want from us?" Brennan turned to him. "I want you to give me those copies. All of them. And I want you to walk away, go back to Fort Polk, file your report exactly as Command told you. Routine supplies, derailed train, nothing unusual. You do that and you live. You get to go home when this war ends. You get to have a future." "And what happens to the evidence?" Hayes's voice was steel. "What happens to the truth?" Brennan met his eyes. "I use it. I've been building a case against these people for months. Your documents give me what I need to take it to the Inspector General. But I can't do that if you're dead. And I can't do that if the evidence is scattered across 8 different hiding spots because you didn't trust anyone." Hayes studied the Major's face, searching for the lie. But all he saw was exhaustion, the look of a man who'd been fighting a war nobody else knew existed. Still, trust was hard to come by, especially for a man asking him to hand over the only leverage they had. Grant's voice was quiet. "Sarge, this could be a trap." "Could be." Hayes agreed. "But it could also be the only way we make it out of this." Brennan took a step closer. "Sergeant, I'm not asking you to trust me blindly. I'm asking you to think about your men. You've got 8 soldiers here who followed you into this because they believe in doing the right thing. Don't let that belief get them killed. Give me the documents. Let me fight this fight. You've done your part." Hayes felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. Every instinct screamed not to trust this man, but every practical bone in his body knew Brennan was right. They were outmatched, outgunned, out of options. If a recovery team really was coming tomorrow, and if that team had orders to erase everything, then Hayes and his men were already dead. Unless they walked away. He pulled the waterproof pouch from inside his jacket. The documents, carefully copied, meticulously preserved. His hand hesitated over the pouch, fingers gripping the edges. Once he handed this over, he lost all control. Once he gave this up, he had to trust that Brennan would do what he promised. Grant's voice was urgent. "Sarge, don't!" But Hayes was already moving. He held out the pouch. Brennan took it, his expression unreadable. Inside were hours of work, proof of corruption, evidence of treason, the truth about who was really profiting from the war. One condition. Hayes's voice was hard. "If you don't follow through, if this disappears like everything else, I will find a way to make sure the world knows. I'll write letters. I'll talk to reporters. I'll make enough noise that somebody has to listen." Brennan nodded slowly. Fair enough. He tucked the pouch inside his jacket. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, you did the right thing tonight. Not the easy thing, but the right thing." Hayes didn't respond. Brennan turned and walked back toward the tree line, his footsteps fading into the darkness. Within seconds, he and his men were gone, swallowed by the swamp as if they'd never been there at all. Grant turned to Hayes, his face tight with anger. "You just gave away the only thing keeping us alive." "Maybe." Hayes stared into the darkness where Brennan had disappeared. "Or maybe I just saved all our lives." Washington approached, his voice uncertain. "You really think he's going to use those documents?" Hayes didn't answer, because the truth was, he didn't know. He'd made a choice based on instinct, on desperation, and on the hope that somewhere in the chain of command there was still someone who cared about the truth. But hope was a fragile thing, and in war, it died faster than anything else. The rest of the night passed in tense silence. The men took their watches, rotated their positions, kept their rifles ready. But no one came, no recovery team, no attack. Just the sounds of the swamp and the slow drip of water from the trees. When dawn broke, pale and grey through the mist, Hayes stood beside the radio tent and waited. By 0800 hours, the sound of truck engines reached them from the road. By 08:15, 3 military vehicles rolled into the clearing, carrying men in clean uniforms and officers with clipboards. A captain stepped out of the lead truck. "Sergeant Hayes." "Yes, sir." "Captain Raymond Pierce. We're here to secure the train and arrange transport back to Fort Polk." The captain's eyes swept over the derailed boxcars. "Command says you boys did good work finding this. We'll take it from here." Hayes saluted. "Yes, sir." He watched as soldiers began unloading equipment, setting up a perimeter, preparing to salvage what they could. But something was wrong. These men didn't look like a recovery team. They looked like a cleanup crew. And as Hayes watched them work, as he saw them opening the boxcars and cataloging crates with a precision that felt rehearsed, he realized the truth. Brennan had been right. This wasn't about recovering supplies. This was about making everything disappear. And Thomas Hayes, standing in the mud with his men beside him, wondered if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. 3 weeks passed before Hayes understood the full weight of what he'd done. 3 weeks of routine duties at Fort Polk, of moving crates and repairing trucks, of pretending that nothing had happened in that swamp. His men kept their heads down, followed orders, and didn't talk about the train. But Hayes could see it in their eyes every morning. The question, the doubt, the wondering if they'd been played. The recovery team had spent 2 days at the derailment site. Hayes and his squad had been ordered back to base within hours of their arrival, escorted by MPs who made it clear that their presence was no longer required. When Hayes tried to file his written report, he was told it had already been submitted. When he asked to see a copy, he was told that was above his clearance level. The train, according to official records, had been carrying routine supply materials damaged beyond recovery in the derailment. The cargo was catalogued, the salvageable items transported to Fort Polk, and the rest destroyed on site. No mention of gold, no mention of weapons, no mention of documents. Just another logistics footnote in a war that was finally grinding to its end. Hayes tried to contact Major Brennan. 3 times he put in requests through proper channels. 3 times he was told no such officer existed in Army intelligence. He tried calling the Inspector General's office. His calls were never returned. He even wrote a letter to the War Department, carefully worded, asking about procedures for reporting irregularities in military supply chains. The letter came back 2 weeks later, stamped insufficient address, though Hayes had triple-checked the routing. It was as if that night in the swamp had never happened, as if Brennan had been a ghost, as if the truth Hayes had held in his hands had simply evaporated into the Louisiana humidity. Grant found him one evening in the motor pool, working on a truck engine that didn't need fixing. The corporal leaned against the fender, his arms crossed. "You still think about it?" Hayes didn't look up from the engine. "Every day." "Me too." Grant was quiet for a moment. "You think Brennan was real? Or you think that was Command's way of getting us to hand over the evidence without a fight?" Hayes straightened, wiping grease from his hands. "I don't know. But whoever he was, he got what he wanted. We gave up the only leverage we had. And now we're back to moving crates like nothing happened. Could be worse. We could be dead. Hayes nodded. That thought had kept him sane for 3 weeks. Whatever else had happened, his men were alive. They'd survived. In war, sometimes that was all you could ask for, but it didn't feel like enough. 2 days later, Washington approached Hayes with a newspaper. It was a copy of the Washington Post, 3 days old, already yellowed around the edges. Washington pointed to a small article buried on page 7. "Sarge, you need to see this." Hayes took the paper and read. The headline was modest, almost forgettable. Army announces investigation into supply chain irregularities. The article was brief, clinical in its language. The War Department had launched an internal investigation into alleged misconduct within the military logistics system. Several officers had been quietly reassigned pending review. No names were mentioned, no details were provided. Just enough information to acknowledge that something had happened without explaining what. At the bottom of the article, a single line caught Hayes's attention. The investigation was initiated following a confidential report submitted by Army intelligence personnel. Hayes read that line 3 times. Then he folded the paper carefully and handed it back to Washington. He did it. Washington's eyes widened. "You think Brennan was real?" Hayes looked out across the motor pool, where trucks sat in neat rows, ready for the next supply run. "I think somebody was, and I think they used what we gave them." Grant appeared, having overheard the conversation. "So what? They reassign a few officers, slap some wrists, and in 6 months everything goes back to normal. That's not justice, Sarge. That's not what we risked our necks for." Hayes turned to face both men. "Maybe not, but it's something. It's more than there was before." The words sounded hollow even as he spoke them, because Grant was right. A few reassignments wouldn't change the system. It wouldn't recover the gold or punish the men who'd betrayed their oaths. It wouldn't undo the damage or restore the trust. But Hayes had learned something in those 3 weeks of silence. Sometimes the fight wasn't about winning. Sometimes it was just about refusing to let evil go unchallenged, even if you couldn't defeat it. May 8th, 1945. The war in Europe ended. Fort Polk erupted in celebration. Men who'd been preparing to ship overseas were suddenly reprieved. The end was finally in sight. Hayes stood with his squad in the motor pool, listening to the cheers and the horns and the sound of a base full of soldiers who believed they'd won. But Hayes felt something different. Not relief, not joy, just a quiet exhaustion that settled into his bones like the Louisiana heat. The war was ending, but the fight over that train would continue in shadows and closed-door meetings, in reassignments and buried reports. And Hayes would never know how it turned out. 3 months later, in August, Japan surrendered. The war was over, for real this time. Hayes and his men received their discharge papers within weeks. The 761st Transportation Company was disbanded. The men scattered across the country, returning to homes they'd left years before, carrying memories they'd never fully share. On his last day at Fort Polk, Hayes walked out to the motor pool one final time. The trucks sat silent in the afternoon heat. He thought about the train in the swamp, about the gold and the documents, about the choice he'd made that night with Brennan. He still didn't know if it had been the right call. Maybe he never would. Grant found him there, his duffel bag already packed, his uniform pressed one last time. "You heading out?" Hayes nodded. "Bus leaves in an hour. Where you going?" "Home. North Carolina." Hayes smiled faintly. "Going to see if I remember what normal feels like." Grant extended his hand. "It's been an honor, Sarge." Hayes shook it. "The honor was mine." As Grant turned to leave, he paused. "You ever wonder what happened to all that gold?" Hayes looked at him. "Every day." "Me too." Grant adjusted his bag. "But you know what? I think about something else more. I think about the fact that for once we didn't just follow orders. We tried to do the right thing. Maybe it didn't work out the way we wanted, but we tried. That's got to count for something." After Grant left, Hayes stood alone in the motor pool for a long time. Then he walked to the base library and asked the clerk for a copy of the Washington Post from 2 weeks earlier. The clerk found it, handed it over without comment. Hayes flipped through the pages until he found what he was looking for, another small article, Page 12 this time. Court-martial proceedings, announced for 3 officers. No names, no details. Just 3 officers facing charges of misappropriation of military resources. The article mentioned that the investigation was ongoing and that additional charges might be filed. Hayes read it twice. Then he left the library and caught his bus home. 10 years later, Hayes was working at a garage in Raleigh when a man in a suit walked in asking for an oil change. Hayes was under a Chevrolet when the man approached, so he didn't see his face at first, but he recognized the voice immediately. "Sergeant Hayes, been a long time." Hayes slid out from under the car, his hands covered in grease. "Major Brennan, or whoever you really are." Brennan smiled, older now but still carrying that same exhaustion in his eyes. "William Brennan, that really is my name. Army Intelligence, retired." He looked around the garage. "You doing okay?" Hayes stood, wiping his hands on a rag. "I'm alive. I've got a job. I sleep at night. That's more than a lot of men got." Brennan nodded. "I wanted to thank you for trusting me that night." Hayes studied him. "Did it work? The investigation?" Brennan's expression grew serious, partially. 3 officers were court-martialed, quietly, behind closed doors. They're serving time in military prisons nobody knows about. The operation was shut down, the routes were closed. But the gold, most of it disappeared before we could recover it. And the men at the top, the ones who were really running things, they got reassignments, early retirements. They walked away. "So we lost?" Brennan shook his head. "No, you stopped it from continuing. You exposed something that would have gone on for years, maybe decades. That matters, even if it doesn't feel like a win." Hayes was quiet for a long time. Finally, he asked, "Why did you really come here?" Brennan reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. Inside were newspaper clippings, articles about military reform, new oversight procedures for military logistics, accountability measures implemented across the supply chain, small changes, incremental, but changes nonetheless. Your evidence didn't just put 3 men in prison. It changed the system. Not completely, not perfectly, but enough that it's harder for the next group to do what they did. That's because of you and your men, because you made the choice to act when you could have looked the other way. Hayes took the clippings and read them. His throat felt tight. The men in the articles didn't mention his name. They didn't mention the train or the swamp or the night he handed over those documents. But Hayes could see the thread connecting it all. The small reforms, the new procedures, the incremental progress towards something better. Did Grant make it home? Brennan's question was soft. Hayes nodded. "He's in Alabama, teaching school. He wrote last Christmas." "Good." Brennan turned to leave, then paused. "For what it's worth, Sergeant, I've spent my career fighting battles nobody sees. Most of them end in compromise, in partial wins, in small victories that feel like defeats. But I've learned something. Those small victories add up. They matter. You mattered." After Brennan left, Hayes stood in the garage, holding the clippings, thinking about 8 men standing in the rain beside a derailed train. They'd been supply soldiers, not infantry, not heroes in the newspapers. Just men who'd stumbled onto something wrong and decided not to walk away. Maybe Grant was right. Maybe it did count for something. That night, Hayes wrote letters to his men. 8 letters to 8 addresses scattered across the country. He told them about Brennan's visit, about the reforms, about the court-martials, about the fact that what they'd done had mattered, even if they'd never see the full results. He ended each letter the same way. "We did the right thing. And in war, when nothing else makes sense, sometimes that's all you can do." Years later, when people asked Thomas Hayes about his time in the service, he'd tell them about moving supplies and repairing trucks. He'd talk about the heat and the rain and the mud. He'd mention the men he'd served with, the brothers he'd found in uniform. But he never talked about the train. That story stayed buried, hidden in the same swamps that had concealed it during the war. Because some truths were too complicated to explain. Some victories too incomplete to celebrate. And some sacrifices too painful to examine in the light. But on quiet nights, when the garage was closed and the world was still, Hayes would think about that moment when he handed over the documents. And he'd remember what Brennan had said. "You did the right thing. Not the easy thing, but the right thing." And in the end, that had to be enough.